We are about to hear from two folks, two government officials, one city, one federal, who are taking a very interesting approach to anti-corruption fighting. As we know, corruption takes a lot of different forms, and the methodologies being deployed by our next two guests certainly speak to that point. And I found the work that they do to be absolutely fascinating, and something that, quite frankly, I didn't think about when I was the investigations commissioner for the City of New York, and I'm so glad that they're doing this work. So I'd like to introduce Minal Patel Davis, who is a special advisor to the mayor of the City of Houston on human trafficking, the mayor being Sylvester Turner, and Porter Glock, who is the procurement analyst with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy in the U.S. Office of OMB. And so your offices are both tackling a form of what I consider to be corruption, which is the prevalence of forced labor in the supply chain that can make its way into procurements, government procurements. And so the net effect is that city dollars, federal dollars, public dollars that come from us, the taxpayers, are being used to buy goods that somewhere in the supply chain used human trafficking or forced labor. And I think we are all of the view that that is just something that we feel strongly against. And you have taken up the mantle in different ways to try and avoid that from happening, to stamp out and decrease the demand for forced labor, these illegally tainted goods that city governments, federal governments, state governments, and private sector companies may be purchasing inadvertently, not knowing that forced labor has been used to manufacture some of those goods. And so, Porter, I'll start with you, and I'll ask you to just describe the federal program, its origin. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing this work, and the origin of the federal program in your office that seeks to address this issue.
Sure. Thanks for having me. The United States federal government is the largest single purchaser in the world. Last fiscal year, we spent $555 billion in federal contracts alone, and that's just the contracts we spend out. That's not the government. That's not my paycheck and other civil servant paychecks and retirement benefits and Medicare and all that kind of good stuff. So, as the largest single purchaser in the world, we have an enormous buying power to shift the market and to create demand and to steer taxpayer dollars in the right direction. We have over 60,000 active vendors at any one time and about 100,000 registered in our database. So it's a large number of large businesses, small businesses, medium-sized entities. So it's very broad, and we purchase everything from pencils to aircraft carriers. I used to say space shuttles, but we don't do that anymore. So pencils to aircraft carriers is what I now say. So what do I do in that realm? And there might be a slide about the layout of our office. So I'm in the Office of Management and Budget. We are an office of the Executive Office of the President, one of many EOP offices, but we are the largest in terms of personnel, and we oversee the President's budget and management priorities. We are in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, which falls on the management side of the House. We have a presidential appointee, Senate-confirmed administrator, who leads the initiatives. And we oversee the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is a large volume of regulations which dictates how taxpayer dollars are spent on federal contracts. We are not an enforcement office, but rather a policy and efficiency office. We try to promote good use of these taxpayer dollars through more efficient practices in line with the law and regulations. We view our efforts to combat human trafficking and forced labor in the supply chain as part of a broader lens of socioeconomic concerns that the U.S. government has. You know, women-owned businesses, veterans-owned businesses, hub-zone, disabled businesses, all types of purchasing preferences and statutory requirements that we have on federal purchases, of which anti-trafficking issues are one. Well, we can talk about the history of how we got into anti-trafficking prohibitions and federal contracts, and that'll be the next slide and my last slide. So April 2006, we put a blanket prohibition on using forced labor and the prohibition of commercial sex for federal contractors in the FAR. Oddly enough, that did not solve the problem. So there's a contractual clause saying don't use forced labor, don't procure commercial sex. However, it continued. So good try, but we got a little more serious about it. It started in 2012. There's an executive order that prohibited many practices closely associated with trafficking. And I always like to preface it here by saying I'm a procurement person. I'm not a trafficking expert. So a lot of this stuff was very new to me, right? What practices are closely associated with human trafficking? Well, document retention is one, right? If you hold someone's passport, their travel documents, withholding travel arrangements, living conditions, if you provide housing that's inadequate or doesn't allow access, that's a big way. And the biggest practice closely associated with human trafficking is the employees paying recruitment fees. It creates debt bondage and is very common, and there's often multiple layers of it, but if you can keep someone in debt, you can keep them working, keep them local, prevent their traveling, you have a forced labor situation. And in studying this and in working in this area for a couple of years, the most amazing thing about forced labor is that a lot of the victims don't realize that they're being trafficked until they're well into their trafficking situation, right? It's a multitude of factors which limit your movement, limit your access, limit your options, and then you're trapped. And it's a little lie that turns into a big lie, and in the UK they use the term modern slavery, which I think is not entirely helpful because it denotes, slavery to us is a very concrete, set thing, but this is the problem of human trafficking and modern slavery is very different. So in 2012, the executive order was signed to prohibit a lot of practices closely associated with human trafficking in the federal supply chain. In 2013, the National Defense Authorization Act, which enables a lot of the procurement statutory change annually in our country, was amended to incorporate the vast majority of those executive actions. Definitely provided a lot of certainty in this space. Typically between administrations, especially Republican and Democrat, a lot of labor executive orders go back and forth. So this created a lot of certainty in this space. So the 2012 executive order, 2013 law, and then in 2015 the federal acquisition regulation changes came into place, effectively putting a clause in the contract into all federal contracts and solicitations which prohibited these common practices closely associated with trafficking. So in terms of timeline, we've only been doing this for 4.5 years or so of really having federal contracts with the clauses prohibiting these practices closely associated with trafficking. In addition to the ones I discussed earlier, the prohibitions, there are also certain requirements of contractors. They need to inform their employees of prohibited activity. They need to flow down the clauses to their subcontractors. And they need to take appropriate actions against those subcontractors who violate the prohibitions. On top of these general prohibitions, an area of specific concern for us is large overseas contracts, which we defined as contracts in excess of $500,000 performed overseas for goods or services. So in those situations, contractors have an additional certification they have to sign on to before obtaining a federal award that provides for a compliance plan. Now, an interesting fact about our system is we don't ask for the compliance plan as part of the solicitation package, as part of the contract inherently. They certify that they have it. We can ask for it at any time, and sometimes we ask for it proactively. And in certain situations, we should ask for it proactively. But in other situations, we don't ask for it. Maybe we'll only ask for it if something goes wrong. Which leads us to our next point is, how do we make this more than just a compliance exercise? It's easy to write policy. It's easy to put in contract clauses that sort of determine contractual liability, but how do we actually move the needle? How do we change things? Well, for us, at the federal level, we really tried hard. This isn't a gotcha game. This isn't a check-the-box exercise. In the regulation, it describes how we take into account mitigating circumstances when there are violations, right? Were you trying to hide the violation, or was it uncovered because you have a proactive anti-trafficking program? I heard at the Rotary event we were at, I heard a major tech sustainability supply chain chief talk about how if they are not finding trafficking in their supply chain, they're not looking hard enough, because at some level to them, maybe down to the mineral level that they're getting for the electrical equipment, something is going wrong. recruitment fees are being paid. So this stuff is out there. So to simply say, if you find it or if we find it, contract's gone, you're suspended or debarred, isn't the most helpful to us. So in the regulation, we do take into account mitigating circumstances, right? Was your company prepared? Did you have a compliance plan if it was required? Was that compliance plan to the appropriate, the size and scope and the activity, right? Buying garments from Bangladesh is going to have a very different compliance plan from purchasing geological engineering services in Canada. Where did the notice come from? Did you find it from doing due diligence work? Great, that's a good thing, right? That's what we should be doing as opposed to us reading about it in the Guardian UK or Washington Post. Did you hide the violation? There's a requirement in the regulation that when you've received credible information of a violation, you come forth to the contracting officer and the inspector general of the agency. And it's really a twofold investigation. On the procurement side, the contracting officer investigates contractual remedies. What do we do about the contract? Can we modify, come to administrative agreement? Where there are bad actors, do we need to have a debarment or suspension type situation? In parallel, the inspector general has got to run the legal investigation, right? Is someone got to get charged with a criminal charge over this? And we try to keep those things very separate, right? I'm not an investigator determining who's liable for crimes, but that has to be reached and looked into as well. So what do we do? We have the regulations, we have the clause in place. We've recently amended the regulation, or really augmented it with the definition of recruitment fees, because recruitment fees were prohibited but not defined. And just thinking about that yourself for a moment, what is a recruitment fee? I mean, is it the subway fare you paid to go to the job interview? Is it a medical exam you paid for a movement? I mean, it's a very interesting question, and there's a lot of concerns from industry that we deal with on all types of issues of, let's say white-collar headhunters being recruiters that are being paid fees. If I pay someone to find a job in the federal government, is that a recruitment fee? Well, depends on the circumstance. Is it a condition of the employment, right? And the second part of that is we're not anti-recruitment fee. We're anti-employees paying the recruitment fee. It is a legitimate cost of doing business that must be borne by somebody, and it should be borne by the entity hiring. It's a cost of doing business. We can pay it if you line it out as a federal contract, and we should be better about asking for what this costs, and we can pay it and start to move away from the debt bondage of the employee. So talking about recruitment fees is very difficult. What is a recruitment fee? So we hope the definition provided, which the ILO definition, the International Labor Organization definition, was based heavily on our draft regulation, which is good. So there's some definitions in sync there. Let's see, am I missing anything in the timeline? I don't think so. The TVPA Reauthorization Act, during the shutdown, you heard about, in the keynote, you heard about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The most recent authorization further codified parts of the 2012 EO, so it's basically entirely codified now. Previously, under statute, only unreasonable recruitment fees were prohibited. Now all recruitment fees are prohibited. So everything's in sync with the regulation under statute, which again is helpful for a lot of certainty and clarity. So where do we go from here? A lot of outreach, working with our contracting officers and the contracting community about what's required, what's needed, providing resources to small and medium business and large business in direction on what to do to comply, right? Again, situations are very different from buying pencils to aircraft carriers all over the world. What are you doing? The Department of State and Department of Labor have built a responsible sourcing tool that's at responsiblesourcing.org, provides guidance for areas and purchase areas, right, different sectors on things to look out for and risks associated with them. So our challenges, how do we flow this down? How do we work this out? We're currently in the process of sort of implementing all this, trying to train our most vulnerable contracting officers, those dealing in the highest risk situations, about signs to look out for, being proactive. One of the beauties of procurement is we can ask for more. You know, we want to use the taxpayer's dollar for the best value, and in areas where there's a high risk of trafficking, we should ask for more and be more proactive about asking for compliance plans and what you're going to do to pay recruitment fees and how you're going to ensure that employees don't pay them. So working our way that way, we have the clause in all federal contract solicitations that provides the coverage, but it's really about implementing it more effectively now. So.
Fantastic. Minal, tell us what you're doing in Houston and the uniqueness of that.
Sure, great. So I serve as Mayor Turner's Special Advisor on Human Trafficking, like Rose said. I was appointed 4 years ago, and at the time that I was appointed, it was the first municipal position like this that had a broad purview over city government and all of the different departments. So we didn't have another office or another mayor's office to consult. It wasn't like the parks director, police departments, procurement departments, and such. So we had to create our own roadmap, and one of the things we did to do that is engage in a strategic planning process. So we did a national listening tour, talked to over 250 stakeholders all over the U.S., and of course took a local landscape analysis as well, took all of that information, put it up against a SWOT analysis, and developed a strengths-based, gaps-based plan to address trafficking in the city of Houston. One of the first objectives we came up with was that we needed to institutionalize the city of Houston's response, because my position can be wiped out by the next mayor. It's election year this year, and so we knew institutionalization was going to be important to help prevent that. So one of the first things that means is engaging our city departments, assessing all of them for opportunity to either screen and refer for trafficking through our health department, or to have a policy to curb trafficking, for instance, like our procurement department. So we have an executive order that Mayor Sylvester Turner signed that actually we looked at the 2012 presidential executive order by President Obama, and we duplicated that at the city of Houston, basically. And our executive order is basically a zero tolerance for trafficking in all of the city's purchasing and services contracts. It's a very new policy for us. It's been about a year and a half. We triple-timed our efforts to get it signed and actually written also after Hurricane Harvey hit the city of Houston, and procurement and the nexus between trafficking and disasters and all of that was actually a perfect storm for this to get signed very quickly and have the lawyers working on it. So we've worked on it with city legal, our procurement office, very closely for over a year and a half, and then it was finally signed. It was ready for that. That's what we do through our executive order. I'll tell you a little bit more about the other ways we work quickly that aren't related, but we also work to raise awareness at scale. I was born and raised in New York, and the kinds of events that you can go to here, we weren't able, or I wasn't seeing those level of events in Houston. So we decided to leverage the mayor's office platform and have very high level events on and bring in international stakeholders on trafficking. So our last event at the Hobby Center, which is a beautiful theater there, was labor trafficking in your supply chains for the corporate community, and it was called conscientious capitalism. Because one of the things we're able to do is raise awareness with the corporate community about their position, sphere of influence, and everything they can do through the mayor's office in a way a nonprofit can't. And our executive order is used to spur or boost that kind of corporate action and raise awareness there. The other thing we do is close gaps in services. I won't go into that too much, but on the sex trafficking side, more so, we do have some labor trafficking victims as well. There were gaps in emergency shelter and systematic access to medical and psychiatric needs. We've worked with a variety of partners to help fill those and institutionalize those positions as well. The last thing we do, because we were the first city in the U.S. to have a position like this that can look at procurement and all of these other things, was develop a 1010 Human Trafficking Municipal Response Fellowship, because we were starting to get informal inquiries from other mayor's offices. Small cities like Rockford, Illinois, big cities like New York City government, folks were calling us to see what we were doing, how it was working, and what they could do. So in an effort to increase our office's efficiency, it is a small office still, even though we've grown, we wanted to formalize that. And so our 1010 Municipal Fellowship does that. In January and March of this year, there were 24 people that were mayor's office designees at the executive level that participated in this 1010 fellowship from 18 cities and 1 state. We are hosting our first international municipal fellowship. Bloomberg's a supporting partner of that this July 23rd and 24th. So we have 8 folks that'll be in the room there. So we're excited about that and formalizing, and most importantly, we're excited about being efficient. Going back to our executive order a little bit, what we're starting to do now is starting to incorporate training or content in our pre-bid conferences to help educate all of the people that are wanting to do business with the city. The goals of our executive order are to effectuate behavioral change. Sometimes that's a little bit hard to measure, but we do have big vendors, just like Porter was saying. You know, United Airlines is a lessee at our airports. Southwest Airlines is a lessee at our airports. Sometimes they go between being a lessee and then a vendor that's providing a good or service. So that's something that might come up. Merrill Lynch, Bankers Trust, right? I know we have a lot of government folks here, so you'll understand this, but if there's a municipal bond deal to expand our airports, those folks, all of the finance world people become our vendors. And again, we're able to push the compliance envelope with large companies and financial institutions by making sure our $5 billion budget, which isn't, you know, it's dropping the bucket compared to the federal government, isn't used to further illicit trafficking activities and that corruption that Huguette talked about yesterday when it comes to procurement. And if the procurement's not done well or right, or people are underbidding, and you have a lower quality product being executed, like our roads needing repair sooner, then that's a problem, because it is public dollars that we're dealing with.
Porter, are there ways that you've been able to track the effectiveness of the procurement provisions that you have in place against trafficking and forced labor?
Well, we're always working on ways to better track and to put numbers to things. The most recent Trafficking Victims Protection Act included provisions that required certain agencies, I think state, USAID, and maybe transportation, to report to the administrator of GSA number of contracts with the clauses, which is hopefully all, but also the number of credible information received, number of referrals made to the IG and to the contracting officers and that kind of thing. Department of Defense does keep a tally on suspensions and debarments and DOJ in the space of trafficking in persons. Department of Justice releases numbers annually on the convictions for human trafficking. So there are metrics out there. In the space of procurement, it's difficult because what I was trying to discuss earlier about the sort of give and take between mitigating circumstances, right? So we don't want people to be afraid to come forward, so we're not entirely sure that the number of convictions or suspensions and debarment is the right attitude. We don't want contractors to think if they come to us with a problem, we're going to be eager to suspend or debar to get a number up to show success. At the same time, you have to show some sort of metric to justify the program. I do think in our office's dealings with lots of industry groups, in our office's position, we have quarterly meetings with defense industry groups, services industry groups, lots of groups. This is a topic they're very aware of, they're dealing with internally. And it's also part of a larger supply chain risk management structure, right? There's a major security question about understanding your supply chain, which I think also helps move the needle in this space somewhat too, right? If we don't know who's making our products, if we don't know who's on our military bases serving our troops food, there's a large security component risk to that, just understanding our supply chain, which is wholly separate of the trafficking risks, but they're one and the same supply chain. So one thing I've learned is trying to understand that and explain that out of the concept of the risks associated with trafficking are much more than just the basic human rights violations and abhorrent practices, but there is legitimate security risks as well. So we don't have good numbers currently on how our program's been effective. We're working on it. We have some numbers and we're looking to improve it. As a member of the President's Energy Agency Task Force to Combat Trafficking in Persons Senior Policy Operating Group, Procurement and Supply Chains Subcommittee, which we are, and co-lead with the Department of State and Department of Labor, we have held a training for our trafficking experts at each agency, and we've had the agencies appoint a procurement lead who's in charge of this space. A lot of them hadn't met each other in previous efforts. I mean, the procurement person just might have known of the regulations, but hadn't met the trafficking expert at their agency, so we had a training to bring them together to at least meet each other, looking to sort of begin the process of looking at their agency's supply spend. And of the 13 agencies who are in that senior policy operating group, they represent over 80% of the federal spend. And so in the 30 people we train there, they have approximately 80% of the federal spend under their purview. And so that's something I feel good about, but there's still a lot more to go, and it's just a very introductory lesson, but we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And Minal, I know that your program is newer in Houston, but you have collaborated with the procurement officials in the city. Are there measures in place for the executive order that impacts procurement vetting in Houston that you envision or that you have currently in place?
So we will always look to the federal government and see what they're doing to follow suit, because we were the first city in the U.S., we think, to have an executive order like this. It's hard to verify something like that, but that's what we think. Now, with learnings and metrics and what we are learning from our executive order, that's what will decide how we start to sort of measure this and quantify its impact. So for us, I mentioned the behavioral change earlier, and that's very important to us. So here are the learnings. They come mostly from our request for waiver provision, and what that is in our executive order is our goal is to balance the trafficking concern with the ability to move city business forward, right? So if there's a vendor that's going to repair all of the city's broken sidewalks, we still need the sidewalks repaired, but we certainly are not going to do it with forced or trafficked labor. So how do we do that? Basically, what we've learned through the request for waivers, when a company requests it, that's when we really sort of perk up. Otherwise, our executive order has become a part of hundreds of city contracts, and we've not heard anything about it. But in the instances we get these requests for waivers, that's where we'll really start to develop what we do. We've learned that multinational corporations doing business in the city of Houston have policies internally that say we'll comply with all of the local jurisdictions' ordinances. So for us, we think for this executive order, the next step is going to be to codify it into a city ordinance, which is something actually Rose had suggested in a conference call. But basically, that's something that we want to do, because if that's the case, it'll make it much easier. Then we have instances where people are negotiating the language for it, and initially it was meant to be a zero tolerance on trafficking executive order. And what we've learned is that, in fact, like Porter's saying, it can't be a zero tolerance. There is something that needs to be mitigated, and it's better that we work with them to mitigate it and maybe even alter that language. What we've also learned is, let's say we have an airline that is a lessee, like I said, about United and Southwest, but now they're going to offer a vendor, become a vendor and offer a service, then they want the language to change to reflect the term of them being a vendor, right, instead of just a lessee. And then you have the problem of them being a lessee, other airlines being only a lessee, never offering any kinds of goods or services, and then there's all of this sort of disparity in how the two vendors are now being treated. So those are the things we've learned so far, and most of it, like I said, comes from when that request for waiver happens. We've definitely learned zero tolerance is not what we're doing. We are having to work with vendors and alter the language. As we go further out, we'll work with groups like McKinsey to see how to value the impact on human life, on the economic impact and things like that. Those are some of the things we're thinking and sort of developing and having those conversations now.
And what are some of the specific sectors that supply goods that are at-risk sectors for forced labor that your procurement departments are particularly screening for?
Major one for the U.S. government is large overseas construction contracts, right, with a lot of migrant labor, especially in the Gulf states. The Department of Defense has bases all over the Gulf states. It uses a high percentage of migrant labor. And again, we're for migrant labor. We just want them treated fairly and justly and not being in debt bondage. So that's a major area of concern. The responsible sourcing tool I mentioned earlier, which is run by the Department of State with some NGO partners, highlights, I think, textiles, food and beverage, and the seafood sector specifically. There's a lot of forced labor issues in fishing vessels, apparently. So that's a major issue that we're looking into, which for us, to be totally honest, is a difficult level because a lot of these contracts, we don't buy fish en masse for the federal government in the way you might think we do. We buy commissary service contracts, and vendors provide the food. So you already, to get to the fish, you're 2 or 3 layers down the supply chain from the government. So that's a challenge. But for us, overseas construction, food and beverage, textiles, and the fishing sector specifically.
Right, and I'd say construction absolutely is our biggest concern. We even do some work with the office that is outside of procurement that enforces FLSA standards on the city construction sites, and I would say food services as well. The other thing right now, Houston's got quite the reputation for hosting world-class events with the Super Bowl. The World Series was just 6 or 7 weeks after Hurricane Harvey. The NCAA championships, we are putting in to bid for the FIFA World Soccer. You can tell I'm not a sports enthusiast, but Thank you,
World
World
Cup.
Cup. So anyway, but we're working to figure out the human rights platform around this and try to distinguish ourselves as a city going after FIFA. And the thing is, if we get the World Cup, it's going to be hosted inside the city of Houston boundaries, but at a county-run sporting facility where the Houston Texans play right now. So what we're trying to do is also make sure that since all the procurement, if we're selected as a host city, will go through the county, making sure we're working with the county to sort of mirror the things we're doing at the city level. Because it'll say all over the world, Houston's hosting the World Cup, but in fact, it'll be a county-run facility and things like that where we have very little control.
One thing we do look at is when talking to a lot of agencies in our training, Department of State, USAID, Department of Defense says, oh yeah, we have risks, we are aware of these large risks. But smaller agencies might not think, oh, Department of Treasury, what am I purchasing that's a big risk? And so we talk about looking at low-skilled labor areas. Janitorial sanitation services is a big one. And anywhere you have a large degree of migrant labor, right? Because again, restriction of movement is such a huge thing. When you're employing people locally, the risk is greatly reduced. So just generally, we talk about areas of low-skilled labor as an area of concern to look into. Janitorial services. I forget, I was talking to a counterpart in Denmark, and I think the offices across the street from the anti-trafficking office in Denmark, or don't quote me on this, but they had traffic labor in their supply chain. I mean, just those things you don't think about, and they had migrants coming to clean the offices, and they said it could have very well been our office, and just those type of contracts we're asking all agencies to look into.
Yeah, and as Porter's talking about migrant labor, I mean, especially after Hurricane Harvey, for rebuilding efforts, you have so many more tenders that are put out there. And there's a move to around the world of migrant labor that is either coming, that's maybe already in the United States through the U.S. visa program for agricultural work in North Carolina, but then get redeployed, and then others that are coming for the rebuilding efforts legitimately. So one of the things we did with the Department of State on the security side or the enforcement side of this is the Department of State has a regional office, and they had put up watchwords around the applications for rebuilding efforts around Hurricane Harvey to make sure the visa program, and the issuances of visas for migrant labor wasn't being violated so that they were not as vulnerable if they were here outside of the bounds of their visa.
It was interesting you talked about the mega sporting events. Again, coming from a procurement, non-human rights, human trafficking perspective, the Department of State had some workshops on like mega sporting events. And I said, oh yeah, that's sex trafficking. We've all heard about sex trafficking during the Super Bowl and all that. But they said, no, I mean, that's an important part, but it's the construction, all the buildup in the years prior to these mega sporting events, which is a huge source of forced labor and a major concern. And it's an area that I hadn't even thought of. I thought I understood it in some degree, but not at all. So.
Yeah, and as we talk about identifying areas, I also want to be clear, much of what we know is the result of investigative journalism or a human rights watchdog. So what we know and what we talk about, like the seafood industry, is because I think Ben Skinner broke a story in the New York Times or something like that. So the world of what we're dealing with is largely a world of unknowns, and I want to keep that at the forefront of our minds as we talk about this. So it's probably much broader than the things that we're listing out, right? But that's what's made the news, that's what's made headlines, and that's where awareness has been raised. So.
And the City of Houston has created the position that you occupy, the Special Advisor on Human Trafficking. It has created the Executive Order against human trafficking, which has the procurement element in it. Why Houston? What was happening in Houston that prompted the city, the mayor there, to create this position? Does it have a particular problem with human trafficking, or just tell us why this developed in Houston specifically?
Sure. So the reason my position was established is because the faith-based groups there had done a massive church letter writing campaign. We have a lot of churches in Houston, Texas, and they had sent about 5,000 letters to City Hall about the illicit massage parlors in the city of Houston. At the time my position was created, we had the highest number of illicit parlors, advertising sex for sale, as per Polaris, the national trafficking sort of think tank that runs the national tip hotline as well. So that was happening, and at the same time, there was a special assistant to the mayor on homelessness issues that had done a rock star bang-up kind of job. And so the donor working group, which was a group of very influential donors in the city of Houston, led by Molly Gotchman, who actually lives here in New York and is the head of the Stardust Fund. She's the president of the Stardust Fund. Her CEO lives in Houston, and they had assembled this donor working group at the Greater Houston Community Foundation saying there should be a position on trafficking that mirrors this homelessness assistant position to start to make a dent. The local media had really caught wind of the trafficking issue there. We're still called a hub of trafficking, although that's a bit of a misnomer. There's no real prevalence and scope studies that tell you whether or not Houston's #1 in the country. When it comes to trafficking, we're the 4th largest city in the United States, but certainly we're not going to have a problem bigger than New York or LA if we had to guess. But the media helped also with the narrative. I wish they'd stop helping now, but they did help. And those 3 things are what led our former mayor, Berenice Parker, to create this position. I was a volunteer member of her task force for 2 months while I had a different, unrelated day job. I actually didn't have trafficking experience before this role, not in any capacity beyond working and volunteering with the New York Women's Foundation here. But basically, that led the former mayor to establish it. So I was on her task force for 2 months, and then she asked me to chair for 6 months. And after 8 months, she said, we're thinking of creating this position, and we're wondering if you'd be interested in filling it, to which I said yes. And that was how it was established. I served as the special advisor for the last 6 months of her term. She was term limited out, and in the last 3.5 years, I've had the privilege of working with Mayor Sylvester Turner, under whom most of our programs have been rolled out, including the issuance of our strategic plan. And I have to say, to have a 64 or 65-year-old African-American male mayor of the 4th largest city as the ambassador when you're talking about trafficking is a phenomenal, phenomenal thing. He's a very powerful mayor. It's a strong mayor system. He also opened the doors for the United States Conference of Mayors, which is a group of 300 mayors with a population of 30,000 or more, and for us to go there and speak about this issue and make it very okay as we talk to mayors across the country, and then, of course, help populate our domestic sessions of 1010 with our contacts at the USCM.
And he's continued to put resources behind your office. You're up to, I think, 5 lines now, 5 head count in your office.
That's right. So we started out just myself and my assistant, and now we have 5 people, 2 City of Houston case managers to receive the referrals on trafficking victims that they're receiving from all the referral streams that we're instituting at the county hospital, at the health department, through our food inspectors. So we have 2 City of Houston case managers that office out of a Salvation Army shelter, because I mentioned emergency shelter was a gap that we filled, and they're a partner in that. And then I have an associate director on trafficking that he and I basically work on the same things. And then I have an executive assistant who I mentioned that I started with, who we call the chief strategy officer of our office, because she has been there 26 years, and her breadth of institutional knowledge and who to call if you want to get something on the agenda and all of that has been a tremendous benefit to somebody who's never worked in a government capacity.
And your role is, we think, a first of its kind in the U.S. The executive order is, and so you were really without peers. And so you did the 1010 program, as you call it, to bring in representatives from other city governments around the country to explain to them and provide training to them about what your office does to encourage other mayors to do the same thing.
Right.
Are you beginning to see that take root? Are there other offices who are now engaging in these sorts of initiatives and promoting offices like yours?
Sure. So even before we did 1010, Humanity United, which is a huge foundation, actually funded 3 offices, mayor's offices, to have positions similar to mine, and it's Chicago, Minneapolis, and Atlanta. So they all have senior human trafficking fellows in the mayor's offices. And the reason that's important is traditionally law enforcement is the only agency that's been called upon to solve the breadth of the human trafficking issue across the world. There's a framework in place that sort of created this law enforcement only mindset. So it's very important to have policy folks working in mayor's offices to address this issue. So those 3 offices did it through funding with Humanity United. Through the 18 cities and 1 state that we've engaged, we have 3-month and 6-month reports that are required, since Jones Day Foundation pays for them to travel to Houston and spend this time with us. And in those reports, we're seeing the procurement orders pop up. We're seeing Los Angeles develop their own comprehensive plan to address trafficking. So we've seen a lot of different things. It's very exciting. Even the state of Texas just made this a part of their procurement. And if anybody's from Texas or has visited the great state of Texas, it is the opposite of New York City and New York State. So that is a huge deal. So we're seeing ripple effects all over. And one of the things we'll be working with the consulting firms, is to try to kind of quantify and capture the tacit knowledge of everything we've done that's sort of stuck in our team members' heads. So, yeah.
Well, all those disciples is certainly a great measure for you. Porter, let me ask you, what do you consider in this work that you've done to be your biggest win or a win?
The implementation of the regulation was a big win, and then in September of last year, we called the 5 I countries: United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK, and I think that's 5, agreed to a set of 4 shared principles on combating human trafficking in the supply chain, of which one of them was addressing trafficking in the government supply chain, right? You can't clean up this if your own house isn't clean. So that was one of the principles. And another principle was striving for harmonization of those rules. So again, we're only in this four years or so. The UK is only in it 4 or 5 years as well. Most other nations are just really getting in the game. But the more we can communicate, share practices, strive for harmonization in our compliance regimes, I think the better off we'll all be. And it'll be easier on the vendor community as well, who's trying to comply with all this and do the right thing.
And what's one concern that keeps you up at night, one thing that you would still like to be able to do?
In the federal space, the procurement of commercial items is a push and pull. There are many different rules for procuring commercially available off-the-shelf items, because if you walk into Home Depot with a government credit card and try to buy lumber and say, I'd love this lumber, but doesn't meet these terms and conditions about it, good luck. So, it's a push and pull between regulating government purchases and making them more easy and simplistic, especially on the commercially available off-the-shelf items. So on some level, my concern is that we're supporting trafficked labor in commercially available off-the-shelf items, and we all do in our personal lives as well, I'm sure, on some degree. So trying to tackle that better, or better understand the marketplace. And think about it in terms of sustainability. There are bio-based labels, there are certain eco-labels that we buy and use in our own life. That's not up to speed yet in personal or government purchasing for labor, forced labor. There's no label saying this is forced labor free that's widely accepted and agreed on. So that's a space I'd like to see grow and continue that we can improve on.
How about you, Minal?
So the one thing that keeps me up at night is actually on the sex trafficking side. We have this prostitution track that is just a blight on our city. There was a really exciting announcement about it while I was here in New York. The mayor has a Complete Communities initiative where it's about having strong neighborhoods all around the city, where there are economically deprived people and just all kinds of things, infrastructure issues that lead to crime. So he just announced that area will be a complete community, which should draw millions of dollars of investment to it over the next however many years. So we're excited to test, at the same time that keeps me up at night, we're excited to test a community redevelopment model to combat sex trafficking. So that's the thing I'm most excited about and the thing that keeps me up at night. My favorite thing that we've ever done through this office is the executive order on procurement.
It's fantastic. Great. So I think we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any. Yes, Mary.
That was a great panel. Thank you for both of your thoughts. I worked on New York State's new law on human trafficking in 2010, so it's not new anymore. And we had a task force of agencies that I ran that task force for 6 years to identify victims and get them services and identify traffickers. I'm just wondering, in the work that you do, how, if at all, do you work with law enforcement and, keeping a wall up between civil and criminal, and how specifically you talked a little bit, Nina, about the work with victims, but between victims and law enforcement, your observations on those two categories?
Yeah, so for us, all we're doing is flipping the traditional paradigm on its head, where victims are usually recovered through law enforcement efforts and then are handed over to a service provider to assist in the aid of a prosecution. We're looking for victims proactively, and I think with the national immigration rhetoric, it's really important that we do that outside of the use of law enforcement by screening in our health department, by having an interlocal agreement with the county hospital system, and making sure that they're starting to screen too. We've in fact put employees there through grant funding and that interlocal agreement. And then truly victim-centered services being provided and then assisting them in the conversations with law enforcement with the ability to always have their case manager with them and aid in the assistance of everything that can happen in that conversation. Really, it should be an attorney that's with them. So that's one way we work with them. The other way we've leveraged opportunity through our Houston Police Department is we have a small investigative unit that does a great job as part of a larger law enforcement task force there, and they do a great job. But we had all of these sort of regulatory police that weren't involved. And when it comes to our illicit massage parlors, there was a tremendous opportunity there. And so they go out 2 or 3 times a year and they canvass every single illicit massage parlor that's historically even advertised sex for sale, even if they shuttered their doors. And they've been able to reduce the number of ads significantly. And so that's something the mayor and the chief of police, of course, want to continue to do. So that's how we work with law enforcement.
The Senior Policy Operating Group of the President's Interagency Task Force on Combating Trafficking meets quarterly, comprised of, I think, 20-some-odd agencies in that group. It's led by the Ambassador at Large of the State Department's Trafficking and Combating Trafficking in Persons Office. But it's policy offices, law enforcement offices, and it's quarterly we get together, talk about what we're doing. It keeps us all informed of each other's activities, which is very helpful. Insofar as a sort of victims approach, victims have come to talk to that meeting, which is helpful. We're always trying to have a victim-centered approach. And on the contract side, we also try to think about response in terms of victims, right? We don't want contractors to just say, there's a problem at X factory, wash our hands, cut contract. Well, we've learned from our subject matter experts that oftentimes that's the worst case scenario for the trafficking victims. So we're always trying to keep in mind in the remedies, the victims first, what's going to help make them whole, whether that's repayment of recruitment fees, changing of practices, but we want to make sure that they're considered first and foremost.
The Washington Post recently ran a story on the cocoa industry in Africa. Sorry, on the cocoa industry in Africa and how the agreement that was reached between the governments and between the manufacturers and the retailers of cocoa hasn't really achieved the results that were hoped for in terms of child labor because the monitoring and the enforcement mechanisms are not there. And what are you guys seeing in terms of having sort of these level commitments that might be in the contracts, but if the compliance and the enforcement mechanisms aren't there where someone's actually going and doing site visits or, in international commercially available goods purchases, that there's no sort of enforcement mechanism or way of figuring out how these goods are being made, even if they are, certifying that they're being made without forced labor.
Yeah, so for us, the policy is to try and stop it at the door and make sure it's not a vendor that we use. And all of us can use our power to buy fair trade chocolate. And things like that. But for us, it really just stops us from trying to get it. Now, before we did the executive order, we tried to go product by product with what the city purchases, and we quickly found out what Porter was saying, from pencils to everything but defense. City government also does. So it was a little bit difficult to do it that way. We started with chocolate, coffee, tea, sugar, anything that had palm oil in it, electronics, so our cell phones. And it became quickly overwhelming, so we did end up having to go the broader executive order way. There are civil justice or social justice organizations on the ground that push the rule of law in those countries, like the International Justice Mission and things like that. And I think that's a prime example of when we need government, civil society, NGOs to help address and establish the rule of law in the source country.
One thing that's sort of a broader point in procurement, especially U.S. procurement, is transparent and open competition. And it does solve a lot of issues if we can have transparent, fair, and open competition. No matter how much I might study the cocoa industry, which I don't, I'm not going to know as much as the entities that work in that industry. And if we have fair, free, and open competitions and mechanisms for industries to report if someone's having an unfair competitive advantage, we can reap the benefits of their knowledge, right? So we rely, and in our regulation, we've had the mindset of relying on the subject matter experts of the vendors. If someone's gaining an unfair competitive advantage by using forced labor, someone who's playing by the rules probably will know they're underpricing their contract and can challenge it, right? So we do, through the competition process, we hope it remedies a lot of those knowledge gaps that we have. So, not the best answer, but it's also recognizing the limitations of our own resources, right? We can't review every single compliance plan and tell you what's the best way to purchase cocoa in the sector of the world, but the entities might be able to give us a better better view on that, especially in their pricing. So,
Jane.
Minal, you talked about the past anti-trafficking fellowships that you've held for domestic cities around the U.S. and how the executive order was such a point of pride for you in your work. Have you heard from other cities who have participated in those fellowships that they're interested in doing a similar executive order to protect their procurements from forced labor?
Yes, so Everett, Massachusetts has made headway. It's a smaller city right outside of Boston. Apex, North Carolina is a smaller city right outside of Raleigh that have already made significant strides in that. I mentioned the state of Texas, though we had nothing to do with that. And then the other city that is making great strides, but I can't commit them to actually being able to get it signed or anything just yet, is Los Angeles, which is a huge city, the second largest, right? So those are the three we've heard back from so far. We're still getting our 6-month reports in which we're hoping, from January we're starting to get those in, but from the March session, we'll still need to get our 6-month reports before we can see what happened from holding both sessions just 2 months apart. So that's been the thing that's gotten the most traction. So 3 already, 2 already, and 1 that's likely going to get it passed. And also South Bend, Indiana, so that's 4. Yeah, Pete Buttigieg. So he sent his senior policy advisor, and she actually wrote back and requested slides for training to the vendors, and they're going to include it in their diversity and inclusion office, right? So you don't have special advisors on trafficking popping up all over the country, but if you don't need to take a year and a half to figure out how to write the executive order, and all you have to do is take the one we wrote and give it to your city attorney's office, that can go very quickly. 4.
Fantastic. Is there another question? Wonderful. Well, I can't think of a better good government endeavor than using the procurement buying power of your respective offices to eliminate and or reduce forced labor. So congratulations, tremendous work, and I wish you many more disciples, and much luck to you, Porter, at the federal level. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.